I wanted to speak to you about Charlie Hebdo, secularism, and the culture of offense. So dissent and criticism of religion has always been a crucial aspect of free expression. Historically, it's been intrinsically linked with anti-clericalism and the dismantling of that which is deemed taboo, sacred, and untouchable by the gatekeepers of power. Such criticism has been key for human progress. In the age of ISIS, this criticism is a life and death matter for those living under Islamism's boot. So yes, I stand with Charlie, the left-wing, anti-racist and secularist publication, no ifs and buts. Those who condemn the massacre in Paris but blame Charlie for offending Muslim sensibilities, and I put that in quotes, implying as if somehow they deserved what they got, have bought into an Islamist narrative that Muslims are more offended by cartoons than by mass murder. The Islamists terrorizing people for decades across the world are often let off the hook because of this conflation between Islam, Muslims, and Islamism. But Muslims did not kill Charlie's freethinkers. Islamists did. In the same way that Christians didn't massacre 77 people in Norway, the Christian far right did, Breivik did. And I think this erroneous conflation is the norm, and it's often promoted in the media by Guardian types, as well as the pathetic excuse of a left, and I say this coming on the left myself, which justifies its cozy alliance with our fascists against their own. Here's a photo of Socialist Workers' Party's John Rees sitting beside CAGE, the organization that has defended Mohammad Namazie or Jihadi John. And the far right also makes this conflation so as to promote its anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim agenda. And of course, the Islamists use it to deflect any criticism as racism and an attack on a community or people. Here's one example. It's the Islamic Human Rights Commission. They gave the slaughtered of Charlie Islamophobe of the Year award just recently. And in the media, we're told it's British Muslims giving the award, but this is an Islamist organization that has very close links with the Iranian regime. And the British government, of course, promotes this type of life as a way of managing its minorities on the cheap by handing them over to parasitical imams and self-appointed community leaders. It fits in perfectly with their massive cuts in legal aid. So the conflation is also validated by multiculturalism, not as a wonderful lived experience, but as a social policy, and also, of course, multi-faithism, which segregates and divides people into homogeneous religious and cultural communities and often sees them as one and the same with the religious right. Muslims in Britain are outsourced by the government to Islamist groups to do as they wish with them, with their communities. Sharia courts, forced marriages, FGM, child marriages, the Borga, Islamic schools, segregated university meetings. The other is different, so doesn't deserve the same rights and freedoms. But as Algerian sociologist Maryam Namazie, and who's the founder of Secularism is a Women's Issue, says, difference and diversity are double-edged swords. We should never forget that they have been used by reactionary forces to maintain in their difference by force peoples and categories of population. What lies behind respect for difference is the deep desire for the other to remain different. But clearly, Muslims cannot be a homogeneous community or society just like any other community cannot. But this goes against the mainstream view, though things are thankfully changing. No community or society is homogeneous. There is dissent. There is class politics at play. There are social and political movements contesting and challenging the Islamist Sharia law, the Borga, the veil within communities and societies day in and day out. Muslims include people like me. I'm included in their statistics on the Muslim Ummah. as I was born in Iran, and Iran is Shia, full stop, and nothing else. Yes, Iran has an Islamic state, but it doesn't mean that it's an Islamic society. In fact, there is an anti-Islamic backlash taking place in Iran. In a sense, you can say Britain is not a Christian society, but a deeply secular one, even if it has an established church with the Queen as its head. It's no different in other societies and communities. Amongst those deemed Muslims, including these two women here, which Islamists feign to represent, there are people like me who are atheists, socialists, secularists, women's rights campaigners, and there are also many believing Muslims who call themselves Muslims, who are opposed to Islamism, who hate the veil, who hate Sharia law, and do not murder even when they are offended by a cartoon. Egyptian Muslim woman cartoonist Dua al-Adl drew this against the Islamists in Egypt. Conflating Muslim with Islamist does a disservice to the many dissenters, and it places collective blame. And anyway, it's wrong to equate the two. It's like conflating the BNP with the British, the EDL with the English, or all Americans with the Tea Party or the Christian right, or all Indians with the Hindu right. You can clearly see these distinctions by looking at the brutal attack on Charlie, if you want to see it. Charlie, for example, is condemned for depicting Muhammad, Islam's prophet, which is deemed forbidden, even though there is a rich historical and artistic tradition depicting Muhammad over many centuries. Saying Muslims were offended as a justification for the killing fundamentally implies that the authentic Muslim is the terrorist and fascist. The cartoons offended Muslims. What about the many Muslims, or those labeled as such, who sided with Charlie? In the attack on Charlie, an Algerian copy editor, Mostafa Ourad, was gunned down in the hallway. A French Muslim cafe owner was threatened for putting up a Je suis Charlie sign in his East London cafe. Lassana Bathili, the Malayan-born Muslim employee, hid customers at the Paris kosher supermarket, saving lives. Even in Iran, a theocracy where blasphemy, heresy, apostasy, enmity against God, and another 130 offenses are punishable by death, Nasrin Sotoudeh, who's been imprisoned before, a human rights lawyer, showed her solidarity, whilst journalists trying to rally in support of Charlie were attacked and prevented by the Iranian regime's security agents wielding clubs and chains. An Iranian newspaper was shut down for publishing a photo showing solidarity with Charlie. Here's a cartoon which says this is what happens if you are Charlie in Iran. Here's another cartoon in support of Charlie, our very own ISIS. In Turkey, the Cumhuriyet paper published 4 pages of Charlie Hebdo's post-attack issue in Turkish. 2 journalists wrote articles about Charlie and published its cover. T24 also published the whole issue without any censorship, much better than the British press record. And at the moment, they're facing many threats, and 2 of the journalists are being prosecuted for offending religious values and agitating the public to enmity. Cartoonists across the Arab world, from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Qatar, and Jordan, took a stand with Charlie and the Islamists and against the Islamists. And we are still told that Charlie offended Muslims, but clearly not everyone was offended. And even those who were offended did not go on to kill for it. What is packaged as offense is really Islamism's imposition of blasphemy laws and theocracy under the pretext of respect for Muslim sensibilities. And only in Europe, of course, does this far-right fascist movement use offense or Islamophobia to silence and censor. In countries where they have state power, there is no need for such niceties. in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Pakistan, in Syria, in Iraq, the offenders are called what they are: apostates and blasphemers, heretics, enemies against God, and legally murdered in broad daylight in the same way that Charlie Hebdo's journalists were executed. Terrorism and indiscriminate violence, including via Sharia laws, have been pillars of Islamist rule for decades, aiding in creating a climate of fear as a warning to those who refuse to submit. Raising the question of offense absurdly implies that civility and manners are all that is needed to stop abductions and the slaughter of generations from Nigeria, Iran to Algeria. But offense is a smokescreen. It serves to legitimize Islamist terror and blame the victims. It's no different from blaming a woman who was raped for the rape. If only she had been better dressed. If only she hadn't drunk as much. If only she wasn't out so late like good girls. Then there would have been no need for the rape. If only. These exclamations are not meant to clarify the context, but to condemn the woman who has been raped. The same is true of those who explain the terrorist mindset. They were angry at the depiction of Muhammad. They were not integrated. They faced racism, blah, blah, blah. The aim is to put the blame on Charlie, on the murdered, on the innocents slaughtered by Islamism. To think this doesn't see the innumerable Charlies murdered over decades across the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, including many Muslims who have dared to speak or mock or just live 21st century lives prohibited by the Islamists. Being a woman, being a free thinker, being gay, being unveiled, being improperly veiled, being an atheist, going to school, driving a car, having sex, falling in love, laughing out loud, dancing are offenses to them. Calling for civility, censorship, silence, or respect for the offended is merely heeding the Islamist demand for submission at the expense of dissenters. But as Rosa Luxemburg has said, freedom is always the freedom of dissenters. Asserting that the problem lies with what Charlie did or didn't do doesn't see the dissent that takes place day in and day out at great risks. Those dissenters are not authentic enough. They must want the Khalifa, they must want Sharia, they must want women in body bags to be deemed authentic and lauded by The Guardian and the Socialist Workers' Party, Stop the War Coalition and Galloway, the likes of them. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave Raif Badawi, sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes for a website promoting public discussion of religion and politics, which has been deemed insulting to Islam by the Saudi regime? 30-year-old blogger Sohail Arabi, sentenced to execution in Iran for insulting the Prophet on Facebook. Poet Fatima Naoud on trial for insulting Islam in Egypt due to her criticism of Islamic animal slaughter. 28-year-old Mauritanian journalist and anti-slavery activist Mohammed Sheikh, who's been sentenced to death in December for insulting the Prophet. Armia, he's a 32-year-old Egyptian journalist who's been given a 5-year prison sentence for causing sectarian strife and insulting Islam because he reported on the persecution of Christians in Egypt. What about the artists and writers in the Gaza Strip who face a campaign calling for their murder for insulting Islam? Or Jakarta Post editor who is accused of blasphemy for printing a caricature of ISIS? Or Algerian novelist Kamel Daoud, who's been called there's been calls for his execution because he has insulted Allah. Or bloggers Tan Yi and Vivian Lee, who are charged in Malaysia under the Sedition Act for insulting Islam and Ramadan on Facebook. What about women's rights campaigner Soad al-Shamari, who's been imprisoned since October on accusations she has insulted Islam and the Prophet for demanding an end to male guardianship rules for women? 47-year-old Iranian-British Roya Nobacht, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for saying on Facebook that the Iranian regime is a little too Islamic. 49-year-old Asia Bibi, in prison in Pakistan for the past 5 years, awaiting execution for blasphemy. 27-year-old Mohsen Amir Aslani, hanged in September in Iran for insulting Prophet Jonah and making innovations in religion through interpretations of the Quran. And of course, our beloved Abhijit Roy, Bangladeshi atheist and scientist, hacked to death on his way back from a book fair when he was signing his book, The Virus of Faith. Blaming Islamist terrorism in Paris on Charlie is like blaming Avijit for his hacking to death. Is like blaming Raif for his lashes. Raif didn't draw a caricature of Muhammad. What did Malala Yousafzai do to warrant shots in her head, being shot in her head on a school bus? What did the Nigerian girls do to be abducted? Or what about the 54 who were just killed in separate suicide attacks in one day, including in a busy marketplace in Nigeria? Were the Islamists who did these acts not integrated enough? Had they faced racism in their societies? Were they abused by security services? And what about the many who have been abused by Islamists or US militarism, who faced racism, who've been disenfranchised and marginalized, but have instead joined trade unions and protest movements and progressive actions to defend human beings and rights and lives rather than going and beheading? Cage Prisoners, which is a disgusting Islamist front, which calls itself a human rights organization, which Amnesty International was working with until very recently. This is a picture of Gita Sahgal, who several years ago was effectively fired from Amnesty for criticizing their relationship with cage prisoners. She said that they are Taliban supporters, they are Islamist front. And we saw recently in a press conference how they had said that Muhammad Imwazi, or Jihadi John, was a beautiful young man, and blamed his beheadings on his being beaten and threatened with beheading by the security services. Well, I've been beaten, and I've been threatened with beheading, and I faced racism. I'm also outraged at US interventions in Iran. I'm particularly incensed at the fact that at the Guadalupe conference after the Iranian Revolution, which was a left-leaning revolution, that Western powers decided that they prefer an Islamic state to a left-leaning one because it was during the Cold War at the time. And still, I don't behead. What self-restraint I must have. Imagine all the people in Iran or Saudi Arabia languishing in prison, having lost their loved ones. An entire generation was killed in Iran. Many of them, their bodies are still unknown to their families. They're buried in mass graves. If all of those people resorted to beheadings, there would be no population left in Iran. The justification for the murder of Charlie's journalists and the murders themselves are the real offense, not the cartoons and not free expression. On another point, whilst the condemnation of terrorism and mass murder may be clear for many humanists and secularists, some still refuse to see the links between Islamism and other areas which have permeated British society. What the director of Southall Black Sisters, Pragna Patel, calls the Shariafication of Britain. It's not enough to condemn Islamic terrorism. You must also oppose Sharia law, the burqa, gender segregation at universities, which is an attack on women's rights, on human rights, and Islamic schools which deny children the right to be children just because they're born in Muslim families. And I think this is where a lot more people get it wrong. And here I'd like to talk about the British Humanist Association, which has increasingly got it wrong on many levels. In a debate with me a few years ago, the then head of public affairs, Naomi Phillips, said that Sharia courts are people's right to religion. And Andrew Copson has recently stated on his Facebook page that he visited a Beth Din and the Islamic Sharia Council with 3 of his fellow commissioners on the Commission of Religion and Belief in Public Life, and was, quote, left without a single secularist reason to say that they should not be allowed to operate as they do. In the Law Society debacle, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, where the Law Society had endorsed discriminatory practices by issuing Sharia-compliant guidance on wills, the current BHA head of public affairs, Pawan Dhaliwal, wrote to someone asking why they haven't joined our campaign against it, quote, the issue has been totally blown out of proportion, and that she has spoken to the lawyers for Humanism group who take the same position. It's just advice so that solicitors can provide a service to Sunni Muslim clients who want a will that fits in with their beliefs. It does not claim to do any more than that. End quote. Well, I beg to differ. And so do many women's rights campaigners, from Ikrowa, the Iranian Kurdish women's rights organization, Nari Diganta, a Bangladeshi women's group in Tower Hamlets, South All Black Sisters, Center for Secular Space, amongst many others. And after our campaigning, the Law Society withdrew its guidance and even made a public apology for being seen to endorse discrimination. So it was not blown out of proportion. The point of view that defends Sharia courts or Sharia-compliant wills as people's right to religion doesn't see that Sharia law is one of the pillars of Islamist rule, as is terrorism. It is a form of terrorism, in fact, against the population at large. This group will condemn the hacking to death of Avijait or Raif Badawi's prosecution, and rightly so, but they will tell those wearing Jesus and Mo cartoons, or tell us for speaking out too loudly again, by saying we're ex-Muslims and shouting our atheism from rooftops, that we are out to offend, implying it is the way that we criticize that brings all these lovely death threats. This group will condemn the stoning to death of someone like Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani in Iran, which was a sentence by a Sharia court. But then this same group will say that there's not a single secularist reason to say that they should not be allowed to operate as they do. But the two are linked. The Law Society practice note, just to give you an example, quoted extensively from an Islamist that had defended death by stoning. You have Sharia judges in this country defending death by stoning. Suhaib Hassan, he's on this side, he says, quote, if Sharia law is implemented, then you can turn this country into a haven of peace, because once a thief's hand is cut off, nobody's going to steal. And once, just once, if an adulterer is stoned, nobody is going to commit this crime at all. We want to offer it to British society. No thanks. That's me. If they accept it, it's for their own good. And if they don't accept it, they'll need more and more prisons. Haytham Haddad, another Sharia judge, teaches that fornication and adultery should be punished by death, and specifically stoning. I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't condemn stoning when it happens in Iran and defend those who promote stoning and want a Khalifa and want Sharia law in this country. You can't oppose blasphemy laws in Saudi Arabia, but tell me and people like me not to offend. Don't tell me I take it too far by renouncing Islam publicly or going nude. As long as people are killed for leaving Islam, I will renounce it publicly. And as long as Islamists want to erase women completely from the public space with burqas and the veils, I will use my body as an act of public protest in support of women's rights. I'm not the one taking it too far. Those who kill are the ones that are taking it too far. And just to make you laugh, that's the Iranian flag, and I've cut the Allah out and put something much more valuable in its place. And that's Amina, the Tunisian topless activist, and Alia Magda El Mahdi from Egypt. Of course, no one is being stoned to death in Britain. But that is because hudud laws are only implemented, and they say themselves, under Islamic states. The perfect Khalifa, then we'll have lovely stonings there. Here, Sharia civil code is being implemented. But as Gita Sahgal, who's the director of the Center for Secular Space, says, there is active support for Sharia laws precisely because it is limited to denying women's rights in the family. No hands are being cut off? Oh, so there can't be a problem. Under Sharia civil code, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. A man can divorce his wife by repudiation, whereas a woman must give justifications and has very limited rights to divorce. Child custody goes to the father at a preset age, irrespective of the welfare of the child. And women who remarry immediately lose their children, even if it's before the preset age. Women don't even sign their marriage contracts. It's done on their behalf by a male guardian, which is why they'll tell you they don't agree with forced marriages, because the dad agrees. So, you know, even if the woman thinks it's forced, it's not forced in their eyes. And they'll also tell you that they don't agree with underage marriages, but that's because to them, a 9-year-old girl is an adult that can be married. So these are the types of ways they fool and dupe the public. Domestic violence is seen as a prerogative of the husband. One Sharia judge has said that there's no such thing as marital rape. Calling it rape is the real offense. You must remember that the fight against Sharia civil codes in countries where it is the law is a main area of fighting back. There's a beautiful song by a campaign in Algeria called 20 Years is Enough. And you see Algerian men and women singing, and some of the lines are, I'm telling you a story of what the powerful have done, of rules, a code of despair, a code obsessed with women. This law must be undone. But here, it's people's right to religion. And of course, Andrew Copson says that he cannot find a single secularist reason to say they should not be allowed to operate. I want to add here, though, that some of our greatest supporters have been humanists. And we have found a home when no one would listen to us, when we were controversial. Now I'm called a human rights activist, but before I was like, oh, the controversial Maryam Namazie. And in many places we weren't given a venue to speak, and it is really the humanist groups that gave us that space and helped us, and it is a home for us as well. So I do want to make that distinction. It's not an attack on the BHA as a whole, but on this policy that doesn't see the dangers of Sharia law and the burqa and so on. And I think this point of view, when you look at it, there is a racism behind it. It's a culturally relativist perspective that implies that secularism, rights, freedoms are only for those who are white and Western. And Western has a very limited sense, sort of like the UKIP sense. Nobody that doesn't look like them fits in. The rest of us, it seems, are only allowed freedom within the cultural and religious confines of Islam. Well, thanks, but no thanks. And you see the same sorts of arguments when we're discussing the veil and the burqa. Feminists defend the burqa as people's right to dress. And I think the BHA does too, but let's not talk about the BHA. It's like saying women have a right and choice to FGM or sati, where they can they've chosen. There was a university group in India that did a study that proved that out of 40 women that had done sati, which is jump on the burning pies of their husbands, 38 did it out of choice. It's a good thing the BHA doesn't live there. They'll most probably be advocating sati. No, I'm kidding. That's bad. Stop now. Okay. So it's when you say people have the right to the burqa, it's like saying people have the right to foot binding, the right to sati, because it is a tool to restrict women. It's different than defending the right to dress. It's actually defending the right of Islamists to dress women and to erase them from the public space. What I say is that these women are the disappeared, like the disappeared of Argentina. The burqa-clad women are the women that disappeared. And you have feminists siding with the Islamists who are placing the burqa on them. Not seen, not heard, and to know what their place is. Defending the burqa is defending Islamism's right to oppress women. It's their flag. It's the first thing they do when they gain access and influence. And it's the same with defending Sharia courts. It's defending Islamism's right to restrict and discriminate and deny. There is no right to oppress. There is no right to discriminate against. Rights are for people. They're not for fascist political movements to do as they like. Ironically, like the far right, which despises multiculturalism, yet benefits from the idea of difference to scapegoat the other and promote its own form of white identity politics, the leftists and the liberals also use multiculturalism to side with the oppressor by demanding respect and tolerance for difference, which as always actually means respect Islamism, no matter how intolerable. It's something I call the politics of betrayal. The other point that needs to be made is that Islam is a belief, like all others, and must be open to criticism and mockery. Equating criticism of Islam with bigotry against people is another tool that the Islamists use to silence dissent and censor. Of course, bigotry exists and we have to stand up to it, but racism is not combated by limiting free expression or by excusing Islamism and Sharia courts. In particular, the term Islamophobia, in my opinion, is a political term to scaremonger people into silence. As women living under Muslim laws say, fundamentalist terror is by no means a tool of the poor against the rich, of the third world against the West, of people against capitalism. It's not a legitimate response that can be supported by progressive forces of the world. Its main target is the internal democratic opposition to their theocratic project and to their project of controlling all aspects of society in the name of religion, including education, the legal system, youth services. When fundamentalists come to power, they silence the people. They physically eliminate dissidents, writers, journalists, poets, musicians, painters, like fascists do. Like fascists, they physically eliminate the Untermensch, the subhumans, among them inferior races, gays, mentally or physically disabled people. And they lock women in their place, which, as we know from experience, ends up being in a straitjacket. US suffragist and abolitionist Elizabeth Cady Stanton once said that the Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. This is true in particular with regards Islam and Islamism today. Of course, when speaking about Islam or any religion, I'm not speaking about religion as a personal belief. Everyone has the right to religion or atheism, but Islam today is not a personal matter. It is the banner of a political movement. It's an industry, a mafia. It's a killing machine. Marx called religion the opium of the people. It would be more apt to call it their genocidaire. When it comes to religion and the state and law and educational system, it is a matter of political power and control, not people's right to religion. Islam in the state or with political power is the end of free thought and the end of free expression. It's the end of democratic politics. It's the end of women's rights, gay rights, minority rights. It's the end of anything that is worthy of a 21st century life. It is a return to the Dark Ages. The humanist response must be to stand unequivocally against Islamism, Sharia law, the burqa, Khalifa, not just over there when it's suitable, but right here. It's not about people's right to religion. It's about stopping Islamism's right to kill and slaughter and discriminate against. A humanist response must also stand unequivocally for free expression, including the right to offend, and equality of all people, not religions and beliefs, universal rights, and for secularism and the separation of religion from the state. It must, of course, stand unequivocally against racism and the far right. Islamism, after all, is our far right, like Charlie did. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between theocrats and fascists versus the rest of us. Muslim, ex-Muslim, non-Muslim, anybody else. As the late Marxist Mansur Hikmat said, in Islam, the individual has no rights or dignity. In Islam, the woman is a slave. In Islam, the child is on par with animals. In Islam, free thinking is a sin deserving of punishment. Music is corrupt. Sex without permission and religious certification is the greatest of sins. This is the religion of death. In reality, all religions are, but most religions have been restrained by free thinking and freedom-loving humanity over hundreds of years. This one was never restrained or controlled. But that is our task. Restraining it, controlling it is what we have to do. It is our responsibility. Thank you.